Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week has been trying to change the world her whole adult life. Angela Davis became famous in 1970 as one of America's most wanted. She spent time in jail accused of supplying weapons that were used in a courtroom attack, but she was cleared of all the charges and she began a lifelong struggle to abolish America's prisons. She's also a very famous feminist, a lifelong academic in California, and has been at the forefront of the struggle for racial justice in America. Angela Davis, welcome. Angela Davis, the world is looking on with horror largely at what's going on in Ukraine. What's your feeling about it?
Well, it's really devastating to have to experience. But I want to also think about the coverage of the war on Ukraine in connection with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I'm wondering, why there was not nearly as much media attention given to the devastation that was produced by the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan. The situation there is far worse than it was when Obama first sent troops in. So I'm trying to, understand the need for an anti-war movement now, and how that anti-war movement might make connections to other social justice struggles that are unfolding.
When you talk about anti-war, though, what does the anti-war movement do about a war like Ukraine, where there is a clear aggressor and Ukraine is now seeking to fight back?
Well, as we have done for decades and decades, we call for an end to the war. We say never again. This definitely should not have happened. And at the same time, I think we have to be more nuanced in our engagement with what is happening in the Ukraine. We should, recognize that there are problems with the involvement of white supremacists and Nazis within the military. So I think that this is an occasion for us to utilize our capacity to think intersectionally, to think in more complex ways. Yes, we want an end to this war right now, but at the same time, we challenge the Nazis, the fascist influence that we've seen in the US, of course. We're in the process of attempting to deal with the January 6th insurrection that we see in places like Brazil, that we see, all over the world. This is a very important conjuncture. And I think movements of masses of people need to, challenge the direction.
But do you support the rights, if you like, of the Ukrainians to defend themselves and to fight? Or do you think they should do something else?
Well, I think that everyone has the right to self-defense. Of course. I'm not contesting that at all. But I do, also think that it is not a simple question. It is not about affirming the Ukrainians' right to fight back or not. It's about understanding the totality of the situation.
Some people might think, well, Angela Davis, she was a communist. She obviously had a relationship with East Germany and with the Soviet Union. What does that mean in terms of how you feel about Russia?
Well, of course, yes, I did have a relationship, as did all of my comrades, with the existing socialist states at the time. And I still hold on to the possibility that we will move in the direction of socialism. The triumph of capitalism, so to speak, is not an indication that capitalism is the best way of ordering economic, social, political affairs of the planet. As a matter of fact, we see capitalism driving racism. Capitalism is racial capitalism. We see capitalism driving the climate crisis. Capitalists only care about profit, even at the expense of losing the very planet that we inhabit. So, yes, I hold on to the possibility that we will discover better ways of organizing political and social and economic life on our planet to the benefit of all beings, not only human beings, but also the flora and fauna of this planet.
So, I mean, in terms of your big beliefs, I hope it's not a caricature or an oversimplification to say, I associate you with the fights for socialism, feminism, and abolition of prison and the police. And you spent almost a lifetime fighting for these things and trying to effect change. Do you think the desire for revolution, perhaps, that you had when you were a young woman was naive?
Well, I don't think it was naive within the context of the circumstances at that moment and considering my own circles and communities. We deeply believed in the possibility of revolution as we saw people in African countries fighting for liberation, challenging colonialism, as we experienced the Vietnamese fighting back against US military incursions. There were reasons to embrace the possibility of revolution. And I don't think that we would be where we are today had we not experienced that urgency. So I am affirming that urgency, even as I say that we did not have as nuanced a notion of the changes that such a revolution might bring as we do now. So I often say that we did not win the revolution we were fighting for. And in a sense, I'm glad we didn't win that revolution because so many aspects of what needs to change would have been left out. At that particular time, we would not have focused nearly as much on issues of gender, on issues of sexuality, on issues of climate change, on issues of the disabled. All of these issues have emerged over time in the process of fighting for revolutionary change. And so now I argue that freedom is not really a destination. Freedom is not that moment of liberation we thought we were fighting for. It is rather an ongoing struggle, unfolding new issues and new fronts and new ideas and new ways of imagining the future as we move forward.
So it's perpetual change that you seek now, not just a dramatic moment of solving the problem.
Well, I don't know whether I ever thought there would be one dramatic moment where the problem would be solved, but certainly when I was younger, I had no idea of the complexity of change and issues that have claimed our attention in recent years could not have been dreamt of at that time.
So the point of this podcast, if you like, is how you change the world as well, and so the methods. So that's what I kind of want to explore with you, which is that you've been part of these movements that did seek revolution, that did seek dramatic change. Do you think, in fact, they are the things that create the pressure for gradual change?
Well, sometimes change is not so gradual. And I'm thinking about the transformations that occurred in the immediate aftermath of the police lynching of George Floyd, the way in which a collective consciousness emerged, not only here in the US, but in the UK and in many places all over the world. That reflected decades and decades of organizing. And what I find really insightful is the fact that sometimes it takes 50 years before this awareness enters into the mainstream and before large numbers of people embrace the notion of structural racism. Some of us have been talking about structural racism for 60 years. And now it's an accepted understanding of racism. So I suppose the lesson is that change sometimes takes far longer than we could imagine. And I feel very privileged as a person who has managed to stay alive for a relatively long period of time, because I feel as if I am witnessing the fruits of the struggles of so many people who are no longer with us. And I like to convey that message to younger people today. Don't only think about what's happening now or next year or even 10 years from now. Imagine what might happen as a result of what you are doing in this moment in 50 years or 100 years.
I mean, that's a really interesting way of looking at what happened after George Floyd, because a lot of people have kind of portrayed this as a sort of a spontaneous outpouring around the Western world, as if, we'd all got to the same point in our minds without realizing it, that we were outraged by this and people just came out onto the streets. What you're saying is actually there was a lot of organizing behind all of that.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that particular moment was a kind of confluence of many different things. And that, as a matter of fact, probably many of the people had been hearing about structural racism for many, many years. But that was the moment that allowed it to really resonate, to make sense. Had people not been doing the organizing and the writing and the art and so forth, then that consciousness would not have been there to mature.
You see, when I began by asking you about the war, you mentioned the differences and disparities in the way we've thought about Afghanistan. And I suppose what that makes me think is that the cultural changes that we thought we'd identified after the murder of George Floyd, and the things that we all agreed on as societies, were perhaps not as profound as we thought. And that actually the cultural change that is required in changing the way we cover a war or talk about what's going on in the world is much more profound than being outraged at a murder.
Well, change doesn't happen instantaneously. I was not under the illusion that what we saw in the summer of 2020 was going to continue to characterize the way people think about racism and embrace or do not embrace abolitionist strategies. It was apparent that there would come a time when there would be a pushback, when the powers that be would attempt to rein in these radical possibilities. That was clear from the very outset. And I think that it's essential that those of us who do have long experience as organizers and activists point out that demonstrations do not change the world. The demonstrations demonstrate the possibility of movements, continuous movements that can indeed change the world. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that what happened in the summer of 2020, that was catalyzed by people coming together, masses of people, millions of people, more people than ever before out in the streets, more white people demonstrating against racism than we had ever before seen in our history. This is a promise. It does not mean that we have securely achieved a moment where we can say that we put racism behind us. It means that there is a promise for the future. But one has to continue the work, continue the organizing.
If change is gradual and can take a long time, do you think things like abolition of the prison system are still possible? I mean, do you imagine that one day it may take a long time, but abolition will happen? Or do you think that in order to deliver proper reform that means something, you need to campaign for abolition?
Well, I don't really believe that reform is going to change these institutions. Um, I think that reform is actually the glue that helps the institutions to retain their permanency and their repressive character. So I do think that we have to call for abolition, but abolition is also something that does not happen in one moment. It is a process, and it's a process not only of wearing down the institutions to be abolished, but it's a process of creating alternatives, of helping to create a world that no longer needs such institutions of violence and repression. So it is about calling for jobs and healthcare and housing and free education and all of these. It's about the revolution, really. We are moving toward an understanding of the nature of abolition, that it is not simply getting rid of an institution, but it is about creating a new world.
But you do think it's realistic, do you? Because if you look at the ebb and flow of politics, in America, we see, Bernie Sanders is not America's future. In Britain, Jeremy Corbyn, who you supported, it's ancient history, and Labour is moving back to the centre ground of British politics. So the idea of sort of these radicals taking power in places like Britain and America is diminishing as an idea.
Well, I don't think that will necessarily guarantee us the changes that we want, even if it were possible. I think that electoral politics constitute one particular arena that may not be as powerful as the arena of mass organized struggle. If one considers the changes that actually did occur in the aftermath of the police murder of George Floyd and the police murder of Breonna Taylor, changes have happened that could not have been produced simply by the proclamations of presidents or the bills in Congress. So while I think electoral politics constitute an important arena, I don't think we should fixate on electoral politics to the extent that we judge, all of the progress that has been made by who is elected.
If we could go back to a little bit of your personal history, I want to try and understand something of, what created that Angela Davis who became so famous in 1970. What was the build-up, the childhood, the experience that created that young revolutionary?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't see my own individual trajectory as responsible for my involvement in struggles for revolutionary change. As I pointed out, and as I always point out, I'm only an individual. My work has been important to the extent that it has been grounded in community building and collectivities. And if people do know my name it's not so much because of what I've done as an individual, it's because of the movements in which I have been involved. And my autobiography, when I wrote it at the age of 28, which was in many ways absolutely ridiculous for a 28-year-old to write an autobiography, but it was precisely because I wanted to write, you might say, an autobiography of the various struggles that I had been involved in. And I still hold on to the notion that it is collectivities, that it is communities that bring about change. And and I am only important insofar as I acknowledge the ways in which large numbers of people organized in struggle help to produce change in the world.
But what made you a communist, given your upbringing?
Well, I was around a lot of communists when I was very young. Let me point that out. So I'm not saying that the fact that many of my parents' friends were communists, the fact that my mother was an officer in an organization that had essentially been built by Black communists in the South. I can say parenthetically that many people are not aware of the extent to which the organizing work of Black communists in the South uh, during the 1930s and 1940s actually created the arena for the emergence of the civil rights movement. But of course, for many years, I considered, communists as my parents' friends, and therefore I was reluctant to join the Communist Party because I felt I needed a more radical solution. But since, I guess I should say that growing up under circumstances of absolute segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, made me value community, made me recognize that our struggles were important, not insofar as they pushed individuals in an upwards direction, but rather as they affected the entire community. So that sense of community has been with me since I was a child, growing up, attending segregated schools and being aware of the way in which um, institutional racism entirely restricted our efforts to live our lives.
Do you remember sort of the first senses of burning outrage as you realized, what segregation meant for you and other Black kids and what the institutions were doing to you?
Yeah, I remember being very angry. I remember being very angry, as I've said many times, when I wanted to go to the amusement park and Black children were not allowed to visit these sites. I can remember attending an elementary school that consisted of broken down buildings and pot-bellied stoves, and looking over to the next hill and seeing this beautiful brick building, which was the elementary school that white children attended. I can remember reading the tattered books that were handed down. So I grew up with this sense of the need to fight back. And I've said this many, many times. I'll say it again. I'm very thankful to my mother for always telling us, her children, that things were not organized in the way they were supposed to be. She always said, this is not the way things are supposed to be, and they will be different. So my mother encouraged us to identify with the possibility of change, but she also taught us how to imagine a different future. So I, learned to both live in a world that was defined by racism, but at the same time inhabit an imaginary world in which racism had been overcome.
And by the time you became an adult, did you believe that the change would be delivered by violent struggle?
I don't know whether I assumed that the change would be delivered by violent struggle. I did learn how to identify with the need for self-defense. And I've always seen violence, if it is embraced by people who are struggling for a better life, not as the primary tool, but rather as a way of defending one's right to struggle. It was clear to me from the time that I was a teenager uh, that the only way change could occur would be through organizing masses of people. And that is the central aim of the work that I do today. That has always been the theme of my life. Of course, I've also owned weapons, but because of the fact that we were all persuaded that we needed to defend ourselves and our right to struggle.
And do you think that stopped at some point? I mean, did America develop so that that wasn't necessary anymore, or is it still justifiable?
Well, of course, this is an entirely different set of historical conditions now. I mean, I would say I still believe in the right to defend oneself and one's movement, but this means something very different in a context where there are more guns in this country, in the US, than there are people. It means something very different when you see the proliferation of school shootings, when you see neo-Nazis and white supremacist groups. I would simply evoke that and would say that perhaps now what we need to call for is we need to disarm not only the population, but we need to disarm the police and disarm the military. Because we see, even as we talk about the war on Ukraine, that the possibilities of nuclear conflagration are becoming even more apparent.
Because I've spent a little bit of time with the sort of the people who say they are the modern day inheritors of your generation, who call themselves Black Panthers or the Fred Hampton Gun Club. I just wondered, do you think they're misguided?
Well, I think we need a more nuanced and a more profound understanding of what it means to struggle for change. And I see, young people who think that they can replicate the Black Panther Party in the 21st century. I don't believe that one can import strategies from another era because the surrounding circumstances have completely changed. But I do affirm their desire for change and welcome the opportunity to engage them in conversation about how we will really bring about revolutionary change in this world.
So what is your advice then to young people who say, I want a different world, I want a radically different world, I don't want gradual change, I want complete change? How should they go about fighting for it?
Well, I always urge young people to think about their own talents, their own proclivities, and to ask themselves how they can discover ways of being involved in movements for freedom that will allow them also to experience a sense of self-fulfillment. So that if they are scientists, science then becomes the terrain for them to make change. If they are musicians or artists, music or art becomes the terrain for change. I try to urge people, based on my own experience and those of my contemporaries, and I have many comrades, friends whom I've known for more than 50 years and who've been involved in the struggle for more than 50 years. I suggest that young people find something that also makes them happy, that makes them understand that the struggle for freedom is not only about making sacrifices. It is about trying to prefigure a different future. One in which happiness is as important as economic security.
If you could go back and talk to the Angela Davis who was on the run, who was one of the FBI's most wanted, what would you say to her about what she might achieve?
I would just say, keep doing what you're doing. Because when that kind of question is posed to me, what I generally say in response is that I'm not so much interested in what I, the elder, would offer as advice to my younger self, but I'm interested in evoking my younger self to bring advice to my older self, because I can remember when I was young, how wonderful it was to meet with elders who took me seriously, who were willing to enter into an egalitarian relationship, who didn't preach at me. And I want to be, that kind of elder who learns how to treat younger people as equals and who learns from their struggles as well.
Well, okay. Well, then, what would the other way around work like? I mean, would the younger Angela think that the older one has gone a bit soft?
Perhaps. But I think that the younger self would also be impressed by the more complex understandings, because that is what I wanted at a younger age. But I, of course, did not yet have the experience and did not yet have the conceptual tools. But I think that if it were possible to reverse time and have the younger activists recognize how much more complicated our work has become. Who would have ever imagined that we would be talking about pronouns? Who would have imagined that we would be at the point where we would have to centralize the struggle to save the planet? So I think that the younger self would be impressed by that. And it also makes me, as an older person, urge younger people today to try to imagine what their futures will be like. What are the entirely unimaginable developments that will define their arenas of struggle? And so, I think this question about temporalities and allowing ourselves to think backwards and to think forwards helps us to understand how movements really make a difference in the world.
My last question is a little redundant because we spent the whole podcast talking about this, but if you could just change the world a single way, I suppose, how would you change it?
Well, I'm, a person who tries to think, this is the word that we generally use, intersectionally. I try to, emphasize interrelationalities and interconnections. And I always point out that there's not just one thing. But since you asked me the question, the thing that I guess I would change would be bringing ever larger numbers of people into our movements. If it were possible to encourage half the planet to join social movements, I would do that. Because I think that is the motor of change.
Angela Davis, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating or a review. Then other people can find this podcast. And you can watch all these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producers are Shaheen, Sattar and Nina Hodgson. Until next time, bye-bye.